Tom Cotton went on Fox Business. This guy's, of course, in the House of Representatives. He's a congressman. And he spoke about some concerning legislation that he's proposing here regarding Chinese people. Let's watch.
So one of the issues that we've spoken about in the past is this intellectual property theft that has been going on for decades. The Chinese Communist Party continues to steal intellectual property. You believe that they are stealing intellectual property right now as we speak. Let's talk a bit about that, because the whole world is looking for a vaccine. And I wonder, is China trying now to come out of this, trying to save face, look better than the rest of the world, while coming up with a vaccine before the United States? What's happening right now with regards to that kind of science?
Well, Maria, the Chinese Communist Party has been stealing America's intellectual property for decades, and they're not going to magically stop in the middle of a pandemic. You know, in almost every state in the union, there are active cases against Chinese nationals. In Arkansas, for instance, they're accused of having stolen proprietary genomes of our farmers in East Arkansas. But in the middle of a pandemic, what's the most valuable intellectual property in the world? It's the research that our great laboratories and life science companies are doing on prophylactic drugs, therapeutic drugs, and ultimately a vaccine. So I have little doubt that the Chinese intelligence services are actively trying to steal America's intellectual property as it relates to the virus that they unleashed on the world. Because, of course, they want to be the country that claims credit for finding those drugs or finding a vaccine and then use it as leverage against the rest of the world.
So I want to ask you about your three pieces of legislation that you've already put out to keep China accountable. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But just what you just said, that is why you believe we should not be giving visas to Chinese students who want to study advanced sciences. They want to get into the Gilead Sciences and the Googles of the world to steal that research. Is that right?
Yeah, Maria, it's a scandal to me that we have trained so many of the Chinese Communist Party's brightest minds to go back to China to compete for our jobs, to take our business, and ultimately to steal our property and design weapons and other devices that can be used against the American people. So I think we need to take a very hard look at the visas that we give to Chinese nationals to come to the United States to study, especially at the postgraduate level in advanced scientific and technological fields. You know, if Chinese students want to come here and study Shakespeare and the Federalist Papers, that's what they need to learn from America. They don't need to learn quantum computing and artificial intelligence from America.
I mean, Shakespeare was not American, so that's weird to throw that in there, but okay, anyway, I digress from that point. Look, if you want to say to me, Kyle, U.S. manufacturing has been outsourced to China, and that's a scandal because that means our supply lines go to China, and you don't want to be dependent on China in a crisis situation, I would say totally agree. And I think that the true left position has been and always will be that some degree of protectionism is merited because you want to incentivize manufacturing here at home. I always said I'm not anti-free trade, but I'm in favor of free trade as a matter of necessity. So in other words, whatever we can make here, we should make here. Whatever we need to import from other places, we import from other places, and we have trade deals that facilitate that and accommodate that. But unfortunately, the way it works now is the corporations have bought Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has then allowed corporations to outsource U.S. manufacturing so they could pay basically almost slave labor wages, some terrible wages in sweatshops so that we can, drive prices down, prices down, drive profits up. So the move has been basically a race to the bottom situation. And I would 100% agree with, and it's weird because you do have crossover between what are called paleo-conservatives and the left on this issue. So you have people like Tom Cotton who, for different reasons, for nationalistic reasons, are like, oh, well, we need to have our supply lines, that are here and not outsource everything to China. We agree, but we agree for, obviously, different reasons. I care about workers, and I want to make sure workers are doing well. He just cares about, nationalism, and he thinks that we have big, bad, evil enemies all around the world, and that's why we need to be more isolated. Whatever the reason is, as long as we're doing the right thing by workers, okay, I agree on that point. So if you say that to me, totally agree. If you say to me, hey man, there really is a problem with China stealing intellectual property rights. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like counterfeit knockoff stuff. They'll throw like Apple logo on something that's not made by Apple, and then, you know, there's a whole scandal of like they're just selling knockoff products, and this isn't, you know, they're violating patent law and all that stuff. Sure. I don't know what jurisdiction we have to do anything about that, you know, and I don't know if like international courts cover intellectual property in the same way that domestic law does. So that's a little bit more of a complex issue, but I would agree to some extent, sure, okay, intellectual property, there's an issue there that needs to be ironed out and handled. Here's where he totally loses me. He talks about how, they might steal a vaccine, and so that would be a problem because then they'd use that as leverage against the rest of the world. Okay, when it comes to something like a vaccine, I don't want to hear Dickie McGeezacks about intellectual property or patents, period. Because whoever comes up with a vaccine, I don't care who it is. If it's the United States, if it's China, if it's Russia, if it's Cuba, if it's Greenland, whoever, the Bahamas, we need the vaccine. Everybody needs the vaccine. So this isn't, and the funny thing is, I think he's actually doing projection. Really, Tom Cotton, because Trump apparently said this early on, like, oh, German scientists, I think, were working on the vaccine. He's like, when you get it, I want you to sell it to us because I want to only make sure Americans have it. Everybody was like, what are you talking about? And I think that's kind of what's going on in Tom Cotton's head. Tom Cotton, you know, definitely thinks like, I want to use that. We, the United States, should use that as a leverage against the rest of the world because that is something like the U.S. would do. So I don't think he's actually concerned. I mean, maybe he is concerned about China doing that, but if China came up with a vaccine, it would be, the whole world would get it. Absolutely. And I hope the case is that if we come up with a vaccine, the whole world gets it. But you never know, because with people like Tom Cotton, he doesn't care about people in other countries. He doesn't care about people in this country at all. But he definitely cares less about people in other countries. So I don't want to hear anything about like, oh, they might steal a vaccine and then that would violate, patent law and intellectual property. There shouldn't be patent law and intellectual property stuff when it comes to something as important as medicine, which everybody needs. So, I'm not concerned about whether or not Gilead Sciences makes a couple $2 billion off their frickin' vaccine. So I care about whether or not people get the damn vaccine. So he loses me there. But where he loses me even more is, and you heard it, he basically said, don't let Chinese people in the U.S. study advanced science. Because in his mind, we live in a 007 movie, and like every person who comes here from China to study advanced science, they're all spies who are going to use our information and our, advanced knowledge against us. Dude, 99.9% of people who come from China and who study here, regardless of what field they're studying, they're regular people. And actually, what's more likely is that they're from more wealthy families in China, and those wealthy families are like, I'm going to send you to the United States to study because they view it as, for whatever reason, prestigious, and you get to go to the great universities or whatever. So, I mean, call it what it is, man. If you're seriously in favor of, like, just saying Chinese folks shouldn't study advanced science in the U.S., I mean, what do you want to call that? You're saying we should separate those students out and have rules against them. Almost like you are segregating them from everybody else, which is, you've gone down a terrible road. And here's how you know what he's saying goes way too far. Just take out Chinese people there and put in Jews. I don't know, man. I don't think these Jews should be allowed to come here and study advanced science because who knows what kind of nefarious things they're going to use that information for. I mean, I don't even have to say anything. That's self-explanatory how terrible that is and how bigoted that is and how wrong that is. It's the same thing for Chinese people. It's not like, they're all secretly spies working for the Communist Chinese Party. Now, don't get me wrong. If there happen to be the 0.1% that are that, okay, well, do standard investigative police work. Make I'm not saying let spies run amok or whatever. Of course, we have spies, other countries have spies. Do the police work necessary to figure out what's going on and act accordingly. But to have a blanket, broad rule like he just said he's in favor of don't let Chinese people study advanced sciences. Come on, man. Because also, one of the other downsides of this, on top of that just being bigoted, is that, okay, but what if it's going to be a Chinese person who comes up with the next vaccine, but you just said you're not allowed to come here because of a blanket rule that I implemented because I think I'm going to treat you all as if you're spies. It's just, he's a dunderhead, okay? He's a moron. And listen, don't fall for the fake, because this is the new tap dance on the right is like, we're nationalists and that includes economic nationalism. So we're going to actually fight for the American worker. Don't fall for the tap dance because almost all these people who are making those arguments now, they all supported all the outsourcing deals. So they're not the real deal, and there are ulterior motives. And a guy like Tom Cotton, this is a guy who's one of the most hawkish neocons that we have. And really, he wants to escalate in a new Cold War and, be on bad terms with not just China, but Russia and everywhere, because he's a neocon, and this is what he does. This is what he wants. He wants conflict. So don't fall for their little faux populism, I care about the worker spiel, because they don't. They simply don't. And he has nefarious and ulterior motives. This is a guy who has never met a war he didn't like. This is a guy who famously was talking about, he was flat out apologizing for torture and saying we should have done more of those techniques at Guantanamo Bay. So he's not a good dude, and I need everybody to keep that in mind. And a lot of what he's saying here goes way beyond the pale. The last thing I'd be thinking about is intellectual property and patent rights when it comes to a freaking vaccine. Let's get the vaccine and give it to everybody as quickly as possible. And it's so beyond the pale to just casually go out there and say something like, oh, don't let Chinese people study advanced science here. Man, it's kind of wild to me that people don't realize in real time just how insane that is. And it probably is going to require, time to get us to that point where people look back and go, wow, that is really not cool that he said those things.